Ambassador He Yafei and Professor David Lampton, thanks very much for joining us. You know, the world is complex and nuanced and challenged all at the same time. We've got a global pandemic. We have a mass protest over in the United States. We have a lot of uncertainty and in changing settings as well. And within all that, a summit took place in Hawaii between China and the United States, Mike Pompeo and Yang Jiechi. Let's start off with Ambassador He Yafei. Tell us, why did this summit take place and what do you take from it?
There are no public disclosure of what had been discussed in the meeting in Hawaii. But I believe talking is always better than not talking. So my guess is that there is extensive exchange of views on very critical issues concerning both countries. They may have agree on something, disagree on something else. We don't know. But I can see a beginning of a good momentum talking. This is one thing. I think I will just briefly comment on why we have come to this place. You know, China's-US relationship. Why here we are facing a dire, perspective on the future relationship. There are several things we need to remember. You mentioned COVID-19. I think this is only an accelerator. It's not. You could say it's a game changer, but it's more a acceleration kind of thing. You know, things are already there, but move faster because of COVID-19. They exposed some of the deeper frictions in the relationship. For one thing, I think it's mostly the relationship going in a bad direction because of the balance of power has changed. This is, Professor Lampton is an expert from a realist point of view on international relations. When balance of power changes, relations between major powers, if one is rising or growing, the other is the incumbent power, the frictions will increase. It's a test to both countries, but it's inevitable. It'll come up in economic issues, on military issues, in other areas, but balance of power changes, things will change and have to change accordingly. COVID-19 only accelerate these changes.
Oh, Professor Lampton, what do you think? You hear Ambassador He Yafei with a clear note of optimism, saying that the inevitable has unfolded. Do you share that same take?
Well, I do think that friction as power relationships change is inevitable, but I don't think it's inevitable how each side will manage that shift. And secondly, I don't think it's always obvious what direction the power relationship is going. In other words, you could have economic problems in the short run, but have a very innovative and dynamic society for the long run. And so judging exactly the state of the balance of power between countries is as much an art as it is a science. And I think furthermore that how we manage this changing balance of power there are multiple ways to handle it. And right now, I don't think either side is handling it very well. But I agree with Ambassador He that overall the momentum, I think was the word he used, is going in a negative direction, which brings me to the Hawaii summit. And I'll speak more about my understanding of the American side than the Chinese side. But frankly, I don't think it was very successful. I don't think it solved any problems, frankly. I think, at least I don't speak for the US government. I don't consult with the US government at the current time, so I'm speaking my own mind. But I think, frankly speaking, President Trump is running for re-election, and he does not want one of the few accomplishments he has in foreign policy, the trade phase one trade deal, to be seen as unsuccessful. And on the other hand, he's built his political brand on being tough on China. So I think he wanted to use the summit for two, what I would call tactical reasons. One, to look tough on China, but not destroy his signature achievement, namely the trade deal. So I think it served mostly domestic political purposes, but it did not fundamentally address the issues between China and the United States. And just to wind up, I do think, yes, friction between our two countries is inevitable. We've had frictions for the last 40 years. And of course, in the Cold War, we had big frictions. But I would say the last 40 years prior to the Trump administration, and frankly, in the time prior to President Xi, we were much more successful in managing difficulties than we are now.
Ambassador He, the obvious question to you would be, if that was for tactical reasons on the US side, what was the fruit? What was the dangling fruit for China? Why would they want to go for this summit? Was it also for a strategic reason, for a show, for a domestic audience, or was there a greater purpose involved?
Well, I have no solid conclusion from that talk. Professor Lampton may have a point, but I don't, from my end, I couldn't see whether it's tactical, strategic, or otherwise. What I'm trying to say, this will give, at least two sides are talking, because so much time has passed, there were no talk at a high level. There is a talk. You cannot obviously expect that the first round of talk of so much time will be so productive. We have to see, and it's kind of result oriented. We have to see what will come after these talks. Trade deal is important, first phase. US election year sensitivity of the election year, and where the two countries will go strategically speaking, because there's so many frictions, as Professor has mentioned, has deepened. Frictions are there, but now has been exposed. People saying, wow, there are so many frictions, and some are very deep and dangerous. So for me, I would turn rather to see whether we can identify some of the major frictions between our two countries now, and how, as Professor Lampton said, how can we manage it better? I think the first one in economic field is decoupling. A decoupling was pushed again and again on the US side by some people we know, of course, out of geopolitical considerations, etc. I don't want to overstate that, but decoupling is happening, especially in high-tech area. Take Huawei, for example, take Department of Commerce of the US, put additional 30 plus Chinese companies on the entity list, and threatening to kick China out of the US dollar system. So decoupling is pretty dangerous, but it is happening. But I do not believe a full decoupling will soon become a reality. This is first thing. Second thing I also want to hear Professor's reaction is ideological conflict, friction. We all know China, US are different countries. They do have different political system, believe in different ideology, but these things are not so prominent in the past 40 years of bilateral relationship. We all know there are frictions, but they can manage that, put it aside, and seek cooperation instead, and believing that more and a greater cooperation will instead give us a platform or some buffer against any ideological conflict. But now, this ideological conflict friction come to the fore. China has been labeled for whatever, and as in short of evil country, almost every bad name has been labeled, attached to China. And China, of course, on the other hand, is not happy, and you have people reacting to that, saying things about the United States. So it seemed to me, these two things, among other things, many things, but decoupling and the ideological conflict or ideological war are most dangerous, because it will only deepen the mistrust that already in existence between the two countries.
I mean, Professor Lampton, this surely isn't unique in the world today. Of course, you have China and the United States, two leading global economies. But if you look at the world as a whole, mistrust, as Ambassador said just there, in our governments, in our institutions, has become something of the norm rather than the exception. So should we be alarmed by what we are seeing? Or should we take a step back and say, well, that's just part of a larger trend that we're seeing evolve at this time?
Well, I do think there are global trends, and then there are the trends in our bilateral relationship. And I think there is a global trend towards more populist leaders around the world, people who try to build strongman political positions by speaking to the grievances of those left behind by globalization. I firmly believe that globalization, we might call 1.0, improved the livelihood of people around the world. Probably 80, 85, 90% of the people are better off. But in each of our societies, there are people who have been left behind, and certainly people who think they were entitled to do better, and they have grievances. And now around the world, we have leaders in each of our societies that plays to these grievances of various sorts, including a rising power such as China that believes the United States is not moving rapidly enough to make room for China in the international system, or worse yet, even desires to slow China's growth and development down. So I think these are, global trends that are also reflected in U.S.-China relations. But James, I wanted to react to several things that Ambassador Hood just said, not by way of disagreement particularly, but by way of elaboration and giving a sort of more American cast to what he said. I agree it's better to talk than not talk. So that was where he started his comments. I certainly agree with that. The reality is that for about 3+ years, we virtually had no what we might call system-wide dialogues on an ongoing basis. It's true our two senior leaders from time to time talk on the phone. They've met bilaterally several times. So I'm not saying there's no dialogue, but there is no systemic dialogue between broad pieces of our various bureaucracies. Under Presidents Bush and Obama before, we had, at least generally speaking, 4 systemic dialogues between the bureaucrats and senior leaders of the two societies on an ongoing basis. And they could talk to each other. They didn't always agree. Maybe often they didn't agree, but they found ways to move forward. And now we don't have those avenues of dialogue, and I think we need to develop them. So that'd be the first thing. Secondly, I think this issue of decoupling, quite frankly, yes, there are a lot of Americans who incidentally probably don't know much about economics that talk about decoupling. And certainly the COVID pandemic raises the issue of reliance on other countries to provide you needed commodities such as antibiotics or personal protective equipment. And also, as Ambassador Hu said, in the security area, high technologies become sensitive. But the point I want to make is it's not just the United States making this point, although unfortunately we make the point, or a lot of people in the US make the point, and that is China talks now about self-reliance. President Xi, when I came into the China field 50 years ago, China was in the Cultural Revolution talking about Zili Gengsheng, self-reliance. Well, you hear that in China too, because as we become less trustful of each other, we're each less willing to rely on the other for essential inputs into our economic or strategic systems. So I would say this decoupling there are people thinking this way in both societies. And so I think we're moving away from what I'd call law number one in economics, which is comparative advantage, free trade, or at least freer trade, and everybody doing what they do best in order to serve maximum welfare of everybody. Those are the kind of principles. Now, they weren't always faithfully observed either by China or us, but at least they were a more shared goal. And so I think we need to get back to what I might call globalization 2.0. And that is, don't throw out comparative advantage. Don't throw out the idea that we each need each other, but let's make globalization more friendly to that 20% of the populations in our countries or around the world that were losers in globalization 1.0. So frankly, I don't think much is going to change until we have leaders who think differently. And that's I think, the core.
I mean, we look back 40 plus years ago, ostensibly what we had were a group of people who were able to look far into the future and were also able to agree to disagree on certain points. If we look now at this declining bilateral relationship, we've got the trade tensions, we've got the tech battles, it's impacting people-to-people exchanges. There's been a blame game over the pandemic. Disturbingly, that's also impacted scientific collaboration at a time when perhaps we need it now more than ever before. Is it possible to manage this talk of a broader decoupling? Is it possible to forestall that decline?
Well, James, I think you're right. We need to look forward, look into the future, not just being fixated on the current complexity and difficulties and feel at a loss as what to do. Always, we need wisdom to look forward. Several points to make. One is Professor Lampton mentioned the less of talks in the last 3.5 years. I also noticed the not too much talk, systemic talks between the two major powers. We need to restore that. But my worry, my concern is that U.S. administration, Trump administration in particular, since he took power, there was less enthusiasm on the part of the United States to engage in systemic talk with China. Economic area is an exception. Negotiations still going on, but in other areas, especially in strategic areas, there are no, open dialogue, heart-to-heart talk, intending to know each other's intentions, to understand what is behind all your policy planning, etc. So we need to start that. If we can jumpstart that will be okay. That's why I'm saying the Hawaii talks could be a beginning. We hope it will be a beginning of a systemic talk between the two major powers. It's sorely needed. It just demonstrates a deep-rooted mistrust between the two countries, two bureaucracies, even two ideologies. This is one thing. Secondly, about globalization. I agree with Professor Lampton, with David, that globalization has changed. There is a critical balance, very difficult to manage, both for China and for the United States. That is, globalization 1.0 has produced lots of wealth, but the distribution of benefits was uneven. You do produce groups of people that lags behind others, especially people in finance, in high tech, lag behind. Their income are either stagnating or decreasing. So they're unhappy, they are angry, and these are the people behind the populist movements. These are the people who backed President Trump, backed Brexit in Europe, backed many fundamentalist tendency. I don't want to say fundamentalist, but those parties on the political right or political left gaining momentum in some major countries. So globalization 2.0 is absolutely necessary, but the key is not to totally negate saying, all those angers should go away. And they will not go away. You see the riots in the United States. You see, turbulences elsewhere in other countries. They are expression of the people. Maybe not in the wrong way, and maybe not in the right way, but they are the real expression of anger, uncertainty, insecurity at the social fabric, social arrangement. So we need to look closely and see what to do to maintain a balance between globalization continuing, no free trade, etc., and also a kind of social justice, social fairness that would distribute the benefits of globalization more evenly. I'm not talking about egalitarian system, but should be either through tax or through other means. Society should be more fair. People should be taken care of, especially those people in a weak position. Lastly, concerning the relocation of global supply chain, David talked about COVID-19 over-reliances on medical supplies from China, and China talking about self-reliance. We are at a critical moment now, again, because of COVID-19. If not COVID-19, it is already happening, but accelerating a trend that global supply chain has been shifting. And during COVID-19, some points have been broken. And look at China. Take China, for instance. China has been faced with a tech embargo, basically, from the United States. That is the backdrop against which you have to view China's, saying we have to be self-reliant in certain areas because we couldn't get it elsewhere. But I do not believe self-reliance is a negation of globalization. China is in full support of further globalization because China's progress so far is a product of globalization, not the other way around. China knows very well by continuing on opening up reform and continue on the path of globalization, it will gain more. It's a kind of win-win situation. If you close up now, there will be nothing for China to gain. But some of the key core knowledge, core technology, if you cannot get it from elsewhere, COVID-19 and decoupling is a sobering lesson. China has to rely on itself or more on itself. That's what I mean.
Well, let's try and bring this a little bit closer together, because Ambassador says that China is very much invested in a globalized future. And when I spoke to Jeffrey Sachs a couple of weeks ago, he spoke about the administration, but then he said there are plenty of Americans like himself who similarly champion a globalized system. They champion a multilateral order that is strong, that is robust, and that is inclusive, and works towards achieving a fair and equitable society, not only for Chinese and Americans, but for people wherever they are in the world. I mean, when you look at that, Professor Lampton, what do you think? Are there ways where halfway points can be established and met? We think about this series of dialogues is called the Pacific Dialogue because it's seen as the midpoint. They met also in Hawaii, the midpoint, so to speak, symbolically between the two. And I'm just wondering whether this particular Hawaii summit was actually far more significant than we are led to believe, because at least they're talking when the rest of the world seems to be arguing.
Well, I think, as I said, it's better to talk than not talk. As Ambassador He said right at the beginning, I don't think, at least I don't, and the people I know do not know precisely what was said and what progress or lack of progress was actually made. So I think we probably need to say we don't fully know the content of the Hawaii meeting, and therefore we're not in a position to make a final judgment. But I think we have a very long way to go. Now, I think it's very interesting that both Ambassador He and you, James, used the word fairness. And remember when we were talking about our domestic societies and societies around the world with globalization 1.0, we said a lot of people thought there was not equitable distribution of the gains. And I think that's true. But I don't think it's just people that felt that way. It's also countries. And this may sound strange coming from the United States, which is a very comfortable GDP per capita. But there's a widespread feeling that globalization was unfair to the United States. Or put it a different way, when China began, and other countries as well, but particularly China, began the process, it was a very poor country 40 years ago. And it's rapidly improved its situation, but still has many privileges, we might say, or concessions that were made under different circumstances that now look unfair and unreciprocal to Americans. So I would just say that this quest in globalization 2.0 is not only more fairness for individuals, but a more level playing field as recognition, really, of China's success. And so I think that our politicians have to recalibrate the distribution of benefits within their societies, but they also have to try to level the playing field that wasn't so level before, for good reason. Not all of the parties were, economically equal. So I think it's a very difficult task. And just I would say one other thing. It's not just the globalization and economic circumstance that's changed, both within and between societies. It is basically our strategic posture. And here you could look at the strategic documents of the United States since late 2017. And what's happened is there is a shift in thinking. I would say for the preceding 40 years, the United States and China basically tried to reassure each other. Sometimes we didn't succeed at that. Sometimes we failed. Sometimes we had crises. But the overall trend was to convince each other that as we each got stronger, we did not represent a threat to each other. I think that basic effort has broken down. And what we are now both doing strategically is organizing ourselves for deterrence. And what deterrence means is threaten the other so they don't do what you don't want them to do. That's the core. And as long as you build a relationship on threat, it's going to be very difficult to reassure. So I think we need in both societies and both leaderships a change in our strategic orientation back to a posture of at least more reassurance, even though we will not get all the way back to where we were, I'm sure. You never can go home. But the long and the short of it is we need to reorient ourselves on how we create more fairness between countries and within countries. And we need to at least have more reassurance and less threat.
So,
And that just would bring me to one final thing. And that is, I don't think, frankly, just looking at the US, and I'll let Ambassador He and Chinese people speak for China, but I don't expect a change in the relationship until we have a change in leadership. And that means I hope that we both sides will plan for a new circumstance, and that we will both think what we can do in what I believe, at least in the US, will be a new circumstance after the early next year. And let's try to think about what we can do to move in a positive direction.
Okay, I have a few points in response to what Professor said about the fairness between countries, among countries. I agree. We need to have level playing field when we compete, economically or otherwise. But level playing fields has to be two-way traffic. China needs to do more. China actually is moving forward, honestly speaking, in terms of creating a better or level playing field for foreign businesses. You know, the recent announcement of opening of financial market is one example. But on the other side, on the part of the United States, it also needs to put aside ideological bias, put it aside, and creating the same level playing field for Chinese companies to compete fairly in US market. By delisting Chinese companies in the US stock market, that's a wrong signal. That's the wrong signal, driving Chinese investment away. That's not the way to do it. So I agree with you, fairness is important, but it's two-way traffic. Secondly, I also agree with you that strategic assessment, strategic judgment, extremely important. And in the past, personally, I led negotiation on on part of China during Obama's visit in 2009 to China. We issued a joint communique. We managed to agree on many things and managed to disagree on a few things. But the important thing is that we do agree that China and the United States should strive to build a forward-looking, comprehensive partnership. We haven't put our bar very high. We're just saying we need to cooperate and form a kind of partnership that would be fair, benefiting both sides. Unfortunately, that fall by wayside when President Trump took office. We need to restore. We need to seriously engage in strategic dialogue to make sure there will be no, either you die or I die, that kind of thing in the strategic competition. Competition is not scary. It's not the worst possible thing. The worst possible thing is try to put the other side into the corner. I'll be very happy to see you dead, or you have to be very happy to see me dead. That kind of thing is not good in dealing with relationship between two major powers. So I agree with you that we need to reverse the thinking, in the minds of many people, especially in top people, that you have everything to lose if US-China are engaged in dead end in the deadly confrontation as strategic rivals. I welcome competition. Honestly, if there's some rules, you have parameters within which you can compete. You can compete and you can also cooperate. But we don't have these parameters anymore. We used to understand, or some parameters are understood, not really have been put in black and white. We understood the parameters, the references, those things we should not do, these things we can do, but not anymore. We're entering dangerous, uncertain waters. That's the most dangerous thing. We need to avoid that. So I'm not particularly, pessimistic about the future. Your last point about change of leadership, I have to say that for China, we are happy with the leadership. Election year in the United States will bring what result we do not know who will win the election. I think we are not going to make a guess. But whoever will occupy the White House early next year, I think they will eventually come to realize what is at stake for both countries. People are now talking more about, for political sakes, it's all of domestic politics, identity politics, try to win more votes. We all know that, we understand that. This is not something strange to China. Every 4 years, we are seeing China bashing, etc. It's all right. It's all right. But what is more important is that we need to seriously plan ahead when the new administration comes into power as to what direction are we going. Otherwise, Professor Allison's, predicament will come to be a reality. That's the nightmare we should avoid.
I have to ask you, Professor Lampton, on hearing all this, we talk about the relationship, we talk about trade, and what I hear from the ambassador also is that at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who get left out on every side, especially small business owners, as we've seen, big business owners as well. And while you were talking about the fairness in the world today, and also using that phrase of making sure that no one gets left behind, which is part of that whole spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals, what do you think that these two countries can do in order to accelerate and to progress the condition of humanity today, whether or not there is a change in leadership before or after the election? What do you think can be done to utilize the next couple of months, especially since we're in the middle of a humanitarian crisis right now in every part of the world?
Well, I think a number of things. First of all, we started with the Hawaii summit. So I would say start talking. And I would say start talking to a dialogue among multiple sectors. And one of the things that strikes me is it's not only top level dialogue that has pretty well been ended, partly because nobody can travel in this COVID. But I think, our people-to-people, our non-governmental organization to non-governmental organization relationships have really frayed. And certainly the NGO law in China was part of that. The pandemic is part of that. Bad bilateral relations are part of that. But I would say as soon as possible, restart as many dialogues between as many bureaucracies, companies, NGOs as possible. So that'd be sort of the first thing. And I commend you, James, and your colleagues for your multiple attempts to do that. We need more of that kind of effort, not less. Secondly, I think, quite frankly, the biggest strategic mistake China's made, or among the biggest, is to somehow lose the underlying support, perhaps is a word you could use, of the American business community. For 40 years, American business looked to the future with optimism. It always had its problems. It always was unhappy about something. But in the end, American business always said better to have good relations with China than not. Well, American business isn't saying that anymore. And so China's got to turn that around. I don't know how, but somehow accommodate American business, because it's an important element of our politics. Now, how you do that, what you do it, what pace. Quite frankly, we hear a lot of happy talk about phase one trade agreement. Well, phase one trade agreement, partly because of COVID, isn't being fully realized, much less phase one never represented the fundamental things that disturbed American business. That was being left for phase two. And nobody can see the day when phase two is going to really seriously get going. So I would say in the months before it, and if there is a change in the US, we ought to rekindle people to people as much as we can. It's difficult with this pandemic. And there ought to be indications that China is serious about at least addressing some of the concerns that American business have. And I don't mean just American business, because the American populace is employed by American business. So I would say those are two things. And then finally, I think Ambassador He is absolutely correct, and China should not get involved in American politics in any way, express any preference about American candidates, donate to anybody, anyhow, anyway. But you can make friends. And I would say, get a map of who your friends are and what you can do, and do as much as you can. And of course, that applies to American citizens dealing with China. And so I think we should do as much as we can to articulate a reasonable policy forward with respect to China. And quite frankly, many people who have such views, and I'd include myself among them, there is just not an environment that's been very conducive to alternative views. And I agree with Ambassador He that our relations have become much more ideological. And the great success, I think, of the previous 40 years really was to set aside our admitted ideological differences and focus on areas of cooperation. So I think that's the only way forward. If we become increasingly ideological in both our societies, and it's not just the US. You know, I just go back to document number 9 early on in the current Chinese government's current administration. That was a very ideological document. So we're both at fault for what I would call the increasing escalation of ideological rhetoric.
James, I know time is running short. I have 3 points in response. One, I agree totally with Professor Lampton that we need to talk. We need to have systemic talk, not only government to government, both federal and state level, also people-to-people exchanges once COVID-19, dies away. We need to increase people-to-people exchanges, especially we need to involve American business in our talks. Let American business see there are still great opportunities in investing in China. As far as I know, there are still American companies planning or doing investment right now in China, despite of the pandemic. So I don't think American business in its entirety has lost interest in China, but I can see a pervasive feeling that they are not happy. They're not happy with the current status. I think we need to do more. Especially we need to dispense with this ugly idea of decoupling. Because decoupling is pushed from the political end. It's politically motivated. It's not economically motivated. So we both sides need to do more to entice American business to continue to engage with China, continue to support a better US-China relationship. This is to. Secondly, for China-US, I think you're talking about fairness. Both domestically, China-US need to take care of its groups of people who are vulnerable, who are angry, who are not happy with the distribution of gains, economic gains, whether by globalization or otherwise. Governments have responsibilities for their own people. They need to put in policies in place to maintain a certain level of fairness. But internationally, I think China has been thinking about that and doing about that, is we need to pool our resources together to help developing countries, especially those countries in Africa, and those countries that have been left behind, so to speak, by globalization, to give them a push onto the road to industrialization. To me, I've been advocating this view for some time now, that the world will not be a happy one. Global economy will not grow anymore if we have a large number of developing countries being left behind. That fairness needs to be addressed. I think US and China have a common responsibility. We need to unite. We need to work together. We had some successful experiences in working in Africa to combat infectious diseases. That was before COVID-19. US, China working together to help African countries to build up a public health response system. So lots of things we can do, but you are right. First of all, we need to talk. We need to set direction, and we need to persist in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Well, as the moderator, it's been fascinating hearing you both engage on some of the most critical aspects of what I believe to be the most critical bilateral relationship in the world today. Ambassador Yafei and Professor David Lampton, thank you for joining the Pacific Dialogue, and we hope to welcome you back again one day.
Thank you.
You're most
Thank
welcome.
you.